Good morning, everyone. You know it's home, and it feels great to be home. When earlier today I got to speak to a group, and the lady that introduced me to my wife was there, and I said it this way. I said, I love her for doing that, and I bet you my wife, Angela's never forgiven her. And then I look out in the crowd, and I see so many friends and relatives, and I'm just looking forward to having a good conversation with you about some of the different scams that we're seeing, some of the different consumer issues to help better equip you with dealing with some of those issues. And of course, we're live, and there are other sites that are watching, so make sure you're teeing up some good questions that I can answer here in a few minutes. I also want to start out with making sure that I thank our partners, and that begins with the SDSU extension. And you see all those folks over there, those are all nursing students that are taking a bunch of social media and getting us questions. Can you give them a hand? I was telling them that I'm married to a nurse, and night shifts are tough, so I was getting them ready for that. And I also want to make sure that I always thank the AARP. The AARP and their Fraud Watch network has been an excellent partner with the Attorney General, and they've helped us tremendously get information out to seniors about fraud to help, again, better equip our seniors with information that is out there. And then I want to always make sure that I thank the South Dakota Attorney General's Office Consumer Division. Now, Jody's here right now, so if I trip and fall off the stage or if I get a hard question, I may call for a little bit of help. But when you look at the Attorney General's Consumer Division, oftentimes you see the Attorney General in those difficult murder cases or tough law enforcement situations, but we do much, much more than that. Our Consumer Division has about 7 investigators, a full-time attorney. They field as many as about 35,000 contacts and calls from consumers a year about issues important to you. And part of the challenge when it comes to the Consumer Division is the ever-changing scams. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing here in South Dakota, again, to help prepare you. One of the biggest issues that is in the news right now is Equifax. And several of you have come up to me and talked to me today about, can you talk a little bit about it? Tell us what's going on. Equifax affects just about everyone. When you look at South Dakota, it affects right now 278,000 South Dakota consumers. And I know some people felt, well, I didn't do business with Equifax, so it shouldn't be a problem. But because they're a credit reporting agency, if you have a credit card, if you've ever taken out a bank loan, there's a big chance that it affects you. And so you've got to make some decisions and be proactive to protect yourself. And what we would encourage you to do is you need to, first of all, find out if you're one of the 278,000 victims. And to do that, you need to go to the website www.equifaxsecurity2017.com. If you don't remember it, go to the Attorney General's website. I've been issuing press releases on it. But you need to go to that website and determine whether you're a victim. And in the likelihood, if you are a victim, you've got to make some decisions. You need to decide whether you want to have credit monitoring, whether you want to have a fraud alert, or whether or not you want to freeze what I would call future credit. It wouldn't affect your existing credit, but to freeze your future credit. And then you've got to make a decision whether you still want to trust Equifax to do some of this, or whether you want to go to some of the other credit reporting agencies like Experian or TransUnion or others to do that for you, and there may be a cost to that. I will tell you, as your Attorney General, there are a couple of things that I'm doing. I've joined with other state Attorney Generals, and we've begun communicating with Equifax. We've let them recently know through a letter that we are not very happy at the lack of user friendliness. We are not very happy that they have tried to take advantage of all the victims by charging them for some of these services I just talked about. And they get it, and they're working through that with us. The other thing that I will be doing as your Attorney General this next legislative session, we're one of the last states to have in place a data breach law. So I plan on putting a data breach law in that puts consumers first on the notifications and also requires companies, whether you're in South Dakota or outside of South Dakota, to notify law enforcement when one of these breaches occurs. So I again would encourage you, this is one of those times that you need to be proactive, that you need to take those extra steps. And like with anything I talk about today, if you have questions or concerns as you're going through that, please let the Attorney General's Consumer Division know. Our number and our information is on all our brochures. It's on our website. That's what we're there to do, is to help you. The other thing I just want to alert you to, because it's something that's coming up and changing, are the Medicare cards. The federal government has decided beginning in April of 2018 through April of 2019 that they're going to issue new Medicare cards. So you need to be aware of that. These new cards are not going to be based upon Social Security numbers. So the concept is that that will make it better protected. They are going to be randomly issuing these credit cards. So if one of your friends receives one and you don't, it's just a random situation. And again, if you receive these cards and you have questions, you either need to let Medicare know or let us know at the Attorney General's office. Before we get into questions, I wanted to give two examples because I think they're kind of heartfelt examples to give you an idea of recent scams that we're seeing and what we're dealing with and how devastating this can be. The first one involves a gentleman that's 88 years old. He has gotten himself in a situation where he is part of what we call the sweepstakes scam, which is where the bad guys are saying that you've won a car, you've won something. They have managed to steal $200,000 from this gentleman. He's 2 months behind on his rent. His credit cards are maxed out. And he still has a tendency to believe that there still is a light at the end of the tunnel. And I give you that example because you all have loved ones that may hear about this. If it's too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. And you need to be vigilant to make sure that they know these are scams. These are people out there trying to take advantage of you. And it's important that you report it to us. If we would have known earlier, we may have been able to step in. We are working the case. We actually found out about it. You know, one of the nice things about being Attorney General and out and about and listening and seeking other jobs is people talk to you. And I learned about this particular one, and then I gave it to Jody, and she's run with it, and we're working on it. And we hope that we can catch this bad guy and make a difference. The second example I wanted to give you, and because it's not just seniors that are taken advantage of, this is a 26-year-old gentleman. It was a dating service scam. And what had happened is, on the long-distance relationship, he fell for it. It's a situation where it has cost him dearly. He sold all his guns and his dad's guns. And of course, I told my wife, Angela, I said, I didn't know it was legal to sell guns. I've never sold a gun before. I just keep them. But it's sad that he has sold a lot of his possessions. She tied him into it so deeply that at one point he recognized he had $9,600 transferred into his personal bank account. And what this bad person was doing is they were doing an IRS scam, and they were taking that money and she was using his bank account to launder the money, so to speak. We have since caught up with it. We are working with authorities from another state. And one thing about this particular scammer, she had very good records. And that works really well for law enforcement when you execute a search warrant. So we saw from her records that she has about 200 victims, about $1 million she's taken people. So these are the type of scams that are out there and that they're affecting people. So I want to just take a minute and update you on a couple of additional scams that are out there that we hear and see about all the time. One is that grandparent scam. What will happen is the bad guys are going to go to social media, they're going to go to Facebook, they're going to go to other areas, and they're going to find out about a grandkid. They're going to see pictures, they're going to know where they go to school at, gain enough information that they can call a grandparent and say, you know, Johnny has a medical condition or a legal problem. And it's got to be urgent. We need the money now. We need it transferred. We need a wire transfer, so that makes it hard for us in law enforcement to track it. And those are happening across our state. We had one case involve $75,000 that a grandparent sent. So if you know of a loved one, you have information about it, you've got to be vigilant, you've got to be bold and make sure they're not doing it. And these bad guys are saying you can't call your son and daughter grandparent because, you know, we don't want them to know there isn't time. Please protect your loved ones. Make sure you're doing everything you can to keep them from making these type of decisions. One of the other ones, and it's a bad one, is we call it the ransom scam. This is a situation where the bad guys, through viruses or through you tapping on the wrong link, are able to put a virus into your computer. And they essentially shut you down. And it has happened in South Dakota to a law enforcement agency, and it has happened to a large newspaper. And what they'll do is they'll say, we have shut down your accounting records, your accounts receivable, everything on your computer, and you have to pay a ransom. And if you don't pay the ransom, we're not going to let you back in. We've had some ugly situations where even after somebody has paid the ransom, They then receive a phone call from the bad guys again saying they're Microsoft and they just need to go back in and determine that everything's fixed, and guess what? They lock you up again, and then you have to pay another ransom. And one of the challenges that I have as Attorney General is my jurisdiction really stops at our boundaries. You know, I have an advantage having been chairman of the nation's Attorney Generals that I can pick up the phone, and I think I have the cell number of every other Attorney General, but if you're getting 35,000 of these problems, there's a better way. And the better way is through education. It's through meetings like this where we can talk about, share this information, and I think being proactive about it is a much stronger enforcement way. You know, the South Dakota legislature, and I always want to say nice things about them, they're very good to their Attorney General, a couple years back put in place some very strong laws against these bad guys. So now that it's a felony if it's over $1,000, and gives me a lot of jurisdiction, but again, if they're not operating within our state borders, or frankly even within the United States, we have some limited jurisdiction. And we're going through some fights nationally right now, we Attorney Generals, about servers and Microsoft and other companies that are out of country, about whether we have jurisdiction to tap into that information, and that's an ongoing fight that you're going to see nationally. I can just give you this assurance, as your Attorney General, I'll keep fighting for consumers and keep doing everything I can do. Before we open it up for questions, the last thing that I want to talk about is the charity scam. You know, we've seen a lot of bad things happening in Texas. We've just seen Irma come through and what it has devastated a lot of areas. South Dakotans are very, very generous in their giving. And of course, the bad guys seize upon these tragedies and they try to take advantage of it. And so I just want to encourage you, continue to be generous, but when you're generous, just make sure you're going to where you want to go to. That if you're given to Red Cross, that you make sure you type in and you're on the right website, that you make sure your money and your generosity is going to where it needs to go to help people and not to the bad people. So last thing before we open up for questions, again, this is about education. If you have questions, look to the Attorney General's Consumer Division's materials. Let us help you. If you have questions, call us or email us. That's what we're here for, is to help you better protect yourselves. So with that, I would love to answer any questions that you have. So I'm going to start right here. What's the phone number? 1-800-300-1986. If you can also call this, I get in a little bit of trouble when I say this, but if that one's busy, call our direct line, 773-3215. She hasn't thrown me off stage yet. So I will tell you, when you have 278,000 South Dakotans affected by Equifax, our phones are ringing, and they should be. And we attorneys general are frustrated, and we're going to work through that issue, but if we're not getting back to you as timely as you wish, it's because we are slammed and only have 7 investigators, and we're going to do everything we can to remedy Equifax and deal with all the other scams.
Thank you. Is that a 605 or is that?
That's a 605. So the second number I gave, and I'm sorry, it'd be 605-773-3215. You know, the great thing about being an engineer is you remember a lot of numbers, so it helps.
Please repeat the Equifax information.
The Equifax information is Equifax Security 2017.com.
I don't know, Marty, if you want me just to briefly tell you about the case I'm involved in. I got an active case against the Rapid City Mechanical business. I don't know if you're aware of that, but I thought I could bring that up.
Okay.
I'm not going to reveal who it is.
Sounds like a good question for a private conversation with maybe Jody. What was that question here? Any other questions?
Marty, I know that states are different. My mom and dad are in California and have both been found with dementia. And luckily, before my father was pronounced that way, he gave me power of attorney. They did not have a living will. They didn't have a living trust. They didn't have anything in place. I think they can hear me. Just in case. My question is, as I was going through my mom and dad's stuff, we found these beautiful cards coming from a family asking for money because she was pregnant and she was this. And we found all these cards and we didn't know this family. We went through the account and found $60,000 that my mother had written checks on to this family. When you hit an incident like that, what do you do? How do you handle it as a daughter who has no rights because your parents didn't give you any rights? What do you do to be able to take care of this, and where do you go?
Couple things to consider. What you described to me could arise to a criminal matter, and that's when you go to your local law enforcement, your attorney general. We see this all too often, what you've described to us. In fact, the legislature studied it. I want to make sure I give the Chief Justice credit of the Supreme Court, David Gilbertson, we call this, in general, elder abuse. That it can be both physical, but it also can be financial, that people take advantage sometimes in the later years. And so we actually have an elder abuse team. It's a small team. It is at the Attorney General's office. It's one lawyer and one investigator. And so that is a dedicated position. We actually have a couple cases under indictment right now. One up in the Aberdeen area where somebody took advantage of, frankly, a veteran and a person later in age on a vehicle. I mean, that company's presumed innocent. But so to answer your question, it could be criminal, and that's something that we could look into, or to seek private legal advice to perhaps bring a lawsuit to have those monies returned. And that would have to be on behalf of the estate. Okay?
Because what I found is because she wrote it willingly, they aren't looking into anything. Is there something as me living out here can look into as the person who's taking care of my mom and dad's efforts, or is that something I have to still stay with the state that it was done with?
You have to stay in the state that it was done with. California would have jurisdiction, and the last thing I would ever want to do is opine on California law. They do things a little differently than we do out here, starting with marijuana.
So we got a question from some of our remote sites, which is very exciting. The folks in the room, we are broadcasting this presentation to online, so anybody in South Dakota is able to watch, and we got a question. So she is at risk, according to the Equifax hack link. She is awaiting a response email from the website and was wondering how long she has to wait for a response.
My guess is with 143 million Americans affected by this, 278,000 of them are here in South Dakota, there's a wait. And that's where you've got to start making decisions. And part of the decision is once you know you're a victim, I talked about the credit monitoring, I talked about the fraud alerts, and I talked about the potential to freeze credit. The consideration you're going to have to do is there are three main credit reporting agencies out there, Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. And Equifax has made this caller a victim. So Equifax is going to, after the Attorney General stepped in and sent him a letter, do those three things free of charge. The other two that didn't cause this breach are going to charge you, perhaps $10 to freeze credit, etc. You're going to have to make a financial decision. How long do you want to wait and what do you want to do? And if it becomes too long, given the serious nature of this, you may want to take steps with the other ones. I can assure you, and you've seen attorney generals do this, we're in the right now stage of making sure everybody gets notified. We're in the stage of making sure that Equifax becomes a little more user-friendly and stops trying to take advantage of the situation. If there becomes a situation where people were affected, and I don't want to speak on behalf of my other 55 brothers and sisters, but I will be looking at, as your Attorney General, is that if you've paid money because of this, looking at getting you reimbursed. And that may be meaning bringing a lawsuit here in South Dakota. That may be joining up with what we call a multi-state, which is probably more likely. You've seen us do it with tobacco, and you've seen us do it in Target and other data breaches. So we will likely do that, but right now, I look at my job as spreading that awareness to say, you got to make some decisions, and then we need to work with Equifax in a timely fashion to make sure you're made whole, and we'll be doing that.
So we got a question out of winter, and then I'll walk over. I will ask folks in the room, please be sure that I give you the mic, because we want to be sure that people in our rural communities can hear every question. Sure. So I'm going to read this winner question real quick, and then we'll go to you, and then we'll go back to you. So, and I think this is pertinent to all of us. They're asking about those hail repair scams, and I think all the damage repairs after storms would be a good topic.
Sure. And we see this with roofing contractors especially, but you see it with paving contractors and other. Whenever there's a tragic incident, some of the bad guys take advantage of it, just like I talked a little bit about the charities. And so when you have some of these things happen because of weather and you have contractors come in, there's some things that you need to do to be aware of. You need to protect yourselves. And what I always suggest is there's never an urgency matter to it. Keep in mind that, like when you do anything, go ask around. Ask for information about, refer to other clients that they may have and contact them. In other words, if they're a roofer, they ought to be able to give you a couple names of people they've worked for and to be able to ultimately have you contact them. There's never an urgency to any of this. I think if somebody knocks on your door and says they're a contractor and they're trying to sell you meat or they got some leftover Pepsi or something, the odds are is this is a scam. There's no urgency. I mean, a reputable contractor, frankly, if it's a good contractor, there's a wait list. And so what I would recommend you is make sure everything's in writing. If you have a question too, check and see if they have a sales tax license. Ask them for it. There's also, I'm not going to get into too many legalities, but you also have a period upon which you can back out of a deal if it's a door-to-door sales. If you have those things come up, make sure you have questions, contact the Attorney General's office. But the biggest thing is no urgency, make sure it's in writing, and check on some recommendations that they have of people that they've worked with so that you can make sure that they're good contractors.
Okay. You turned me off. Oh, okay. Here we go. I've had the Department of the Treasury calling me from Princeton, New Jersey, Tyler, Texas, Wisconsin, you name it. They call me 2 and 3 times a day, and they want to give me $9,200.
And then they want you to pay taxes and wire it to them.
Oh, and they want my bank account number and everything else. So what can we do about robocalls?
Robocalls. Right now, there is technology out there that can fix this. But the federal government isn't acting on it very quickly and efficiently. And so it's moving forward. You'll see, hopefully, in the near future, opportunities that they will instill this technology to solve that. So until the federal government acts, we're in a situation where we've got to be vigilant, hang up those phone calls. For gosh sakes, don't wire them the taxes in relation to that or give them any personal bank account information. Those are scams. And hopefully, one of the, I mentioned earlier, as an electrical engineer, I love technology. And it allows us to do so many great things, but it also, in the hands of bad people, allows them to be more effective at their scamming with the phishing schemes that are out there and those other things. But we need to then use technology, like that technology that I talked about on the robocalls and the telemarketers, to protect us. And it's going in that direction. There shouldn't need to be a lot of politics with it. It should move forward a lot more efficiently and quickly. But I always like to say, as a former U.S. attorney, I'm a recovering Fed. I now work for the state, and so it's coming. Be patient.
So we got another question here in Rapid City, and then we'll take one from Pierre.
I'm going back to the Equifax thing. If you freeze at one of those places, does it freeze all of them? Or do you have to freeze all 3 of them?
I think to be safe, you should freeze all 3 of them. And I know what that means is that means either $30 or $20. If Equifax is charging you $10, I need to know about it. So Experian and TransUnion probably are going to charge you $10.
Okay, well, my husband's was compromised, and since mine's tied in, he's my husband, I decided I should freeze mine also.
When we watch, and we see this in the consumer division, when you lose your identity, when somebody steals your identity because they've gotten, and I mean, let's face it, Equifax has given out Social Security numbers, they've given out birth dates, names, addresses, in some instances, your driver's license number. $20 or $30 is probably well spent to protect you. And your Attorney General is going to do everything he can do to try to get you that back. It's just, right now we need to make sure we're protecting things. But it's a small price to pay, and it's unfortunate because many of you didn't do business with Equifax, and yet your credit may be compromised. But I think it's something that you need to make an informed decision on, and that's part of the conversation today is that informed decision that you've got options, and you've got options with credit monitoring, credit alerts, freezes. Make sure you know, though, when you're doing a freeze, it's for freezing future credit, not for existing credit. So you got to make sure you're keeping that in mind. They all have advantages to protecting you at different levels, but you may have to upfront put out some money, and the hope is that as we go down the road that you can be made whole for that. But that's yet to be seen, and we're working towards that.
So Marty, Pierre would like to know how Equifax got all of our information.
That's a great question, and people are frustrated over it because they are a credit reporting agency. They get that information from credit card companies, from banks, and other places such as that you have done business. Odds are you signed something along the way, either in a credit card application or a bank loan, that they were able to do this. People are frustrated. I think it's a recognition, again, that we live in a society of technology, a lot of great things with technology, but our privacy is compromised with some of that. And the hope is that technology can do a better job of protecting it. And it's unfortunate that we're in a place right now where so many South Dakotans and Americans now have a security concern. And a security concern that this is one of those instances when you didn't do anything, that you were not at all at fault on this, but you've got to do something now. You've got to make those informed decisions on proactively determining whether you're a victim and proactively deciding how you're going to handle it. And again, we can help you to give you more information and make an informed decision at the Attorney General's office, but it's frustrating.
So we got another question locally, and I got a couple more coming in from our rural community, so let's start here.
Well, I have a question. I retired from the VA, and when the government was hacked, I'm sure my information was hacked. So then they said, go ahead and freeze with Equifax, Transperian, and the other one. So I did that. So how long does the freeze last? And it seems to me, I don't care who they are, that we are not secure giving all this information out with our credit cards. Our Social Security that's not even secure anymore. It seems like nothing is secure anymore.
To answer your question, Jody confirmed it, it's 7 years. So it's 7 years, and I think it's to the level now, which goes back to what I talked about as your Attorney General. I will be bringing legislation this session. This legislation will put consumers first in making sure they get notified timely. It will also put law enforcement in place. And I'm going to make it a felony if certain rules aren't followed. It's that serious. But, people commit felonies every day. That's what keeps me employed as your Attorney General. And it's frustrating. And I think that the best answer is you need to do everything you can to guard your personal information. And sometimes, like Equifax, it's going to happen anyhow, but you need to make sure you're doing everything you can, and you need to make sure your elected officials know that you're not happy when you get those robocalls and the federal government hasn't done anything about it. You need to let your local officials in the legislature know how much you appreciate that they backed your Attorney General when he said make this stuff a felony. And those are the things that you can do outside of just making sure you protect your personal information.
I've got two comments. One is on the robocalls. We're seeing quite an uptick in this area, excuse me, on spoofed numbers that are on the local exchange. Some of them are legitimate numbers, and other ones are numbers that aren't in service. My wife answered one night because it was her hairdresser, only to find out that, congratulations, you won a vacation. So is there anything that we're doing on those, or do they fall under the rest of the spoof numbers that might not even be coming from in-state?
I think the way to best answer that is I think the technology is out there to separate that and address it. It just has to have federal approval, and we're waiting.
The other one I have is on the contractors that show up after a hailstorm or, you know, that type of damage. I know that there are contractors that come into this state and will go to legitimate contractors that are here in the state that have a business license and wave a bunch of money in front of them, let me operate under your license. Is that against the law in this state to do that?
It's going to depend upon the specific relationship that they have. So there are times when they can do it and times when they can't. Again, it's going to depend upon what the relationship is, whether they're an employee, whether they're an independent contractor. So there's a lot of legal issues with that. And it goes back to the best way to protect you on that is make sure you've got a written contract. Part of that written contract, and it kind of goes to your question, is make sure the contractor's bonded or has insurance and make sure it's set forth in that contract. Get references. You know, go get 2 or 3 references. I mean, it's important, especially when you're going to be paving your driveway or, you know, roofing your house or other things, to just put a little bit of work in on the front end. We've had some bad situations. We had Barron Builders. It was a criminal case that our office got involved in. And the last thing you want to be, don't take this wrong, is one of the victims, the Attorney General's office, is trying to get your money back. Protect yourself at the front end. Don't get that money out on front in the first instance, and you'll be much better off. Yep.
So we're going to take a couple questions from our remote communities. I have volunteers walking around. I probably won't get to all your questions, so we're going to have our volunteers write down questions, and we'll get you answers because we may run out of time today. So from Pierre, I think these questions are related. How are scammers getting our phone numbers? Why doesn't the do not call list not work? And is the Fraternal Order of the Police a legitimate organization? So there's 3 questions in there.
Let me start with the easy one because they always endorse me and give me good stuff. Yes, the Fraternal Order of Police is very important and a very good organization, but that doesn't mean, like any organization, that the bad guys don't try to use some organization for inappropriate activities. So yes, take good care of your men and women in blue and their different organizations. You know, the do not call list is under the PUC. It's not under the Attorney General. We have a very close relationship with the PUC and we work together. And I know there's a frustration with robocalls, and it's a frustration that I don't just hear from the public. I hear it from the legislature. And you know, the South Dakota legislature has put in place certain rules with robocalls. You may recall a few years back, I as Attorney General brought a criminal case. It was a political one where certain guys were inappropriately doing the robocalls in violation of state statute. And I prosecuted them for it and convicted them for it. It was just a misdemeanor, and it obviously hasn't had enough effect. Maybe we need to look and make that a felony. But the reality is it's not working. It's because the technology hasn't been employed, and we need to employ the technology so that it better protects consumers. And I'm not sure why the federal government isn't acting to protect you. They should be, and I will continue to be a strong, strong voice when it comes to, on your behalf, on all these different areas where the federal government needs to and can do better. And until then, I'm left with a misdemeanor statute. I'll continue when we can identify violations, act on them depending upon what the circumstance is. The political ones are easier because we have a very specific statute when these political robocalls can be done, et cetera, and how they can be done. But it's a problem. And I think it signals it's a problem by the number of questions that we're getting on this topic. Like I said, the PUC is in charge of the do not call list, but this is not their fault. This is the fault of the federal government not acting quickly and in the interest of the public when it comes to some of this technology.
So this gentleman has a question.
A little over a year ago, I started receiving some unwanted or unordered credit cards, and so I immediately contacted all 3 of the credit bureaus, and they put a freeze. It was not at the 7-year, but put a freeze on it. There was a couple other instances that they reported to me that I had other applications, and in addition to that, I went to the bank and asked them which would be a good credit bureau to check with, and they mentioned LifeLock. It wasn't too long after that one day in the email I got an email which might not have been it might have been bogus. They said they were having a class action suit against LifeLock because they weren't doing anything. And I didn't follow through with that. My point is, I paid them $100 a month, or $100 a year, and they said, you know, they would do all this stuff, and then they come back and said, oh yeah, for another amount, we will really fix you up, you know, and really do a good job. My question is my initial $100 a year, which they have made an automatic renewal, have you heard anything about them? Do you know if they're legitimate or not? And
here's what I would suggest, and this is where it is so important. When you have this happen, you have to let us know. So please call 1-800-300-1986. Let us know. We keep open files on different categories, and then we break them down further on different bad actors. And when we see I like to call it a pattern. In other words, if it's just one company, one complaint, I'm not going to be able to do as much as if it's one company and 50 complaints, right? And so please give us a contact there. LifeLock is a company, but whether or not obviously they didn't provide the service that you wanted, and you don't feel like you got your money's value out of it. And so at the least bit, we have what's called a mediation service. And what I found, and I want to especially say with South Dakota retailers or South Dakota companies, oftentimes when you as a consumer contact us and say, I have a problem with company X, and we send a letter to company X and says, and signed, you know, from the Attorney General that says, you know, one of your consumers, one of your clients had a concern about your contract or your services, I'd appreciate it if you'd maybe reach out to them and talk to them. And by the way, if you don't, you know, we have some services we offer, mediation or other things I can do. 99% of the time when that Attorney General letter goes out, they self-resolve it. In fact, this morning at the Alzheimer's event, I had a gentleman come up and thank me that it was one of those instances when we sent that type of letter and it just took care of itself. Most South Dakota businesses don't want their customers mad at them. And they just don't even know that it's a concern. And so we offer that service too, where we send the letter and perhaps maybe it would mediate. And maybe they can convince you that they gave you $50 worth of service a year rather than $100, and you guys can resolve your differences. But that's a valued service that we have available and that we offer all the time. And so the two things I'd like to just, not to be repetitive, but you got to let us know so we can keep track of the patterns and be aware of where the bad guys are. And there may be an instance we can help with that mediation or the letter service. Great question.
We have really blown through our time. It's quite amazing. But we've got 3 questions that I'm going to get through. If you have a question that you would like answered, please have one of these 2 write it down for you. Jody has a booth downstairs. She will do her best to help you out with that answer. So we're going to start with the question there. Then we have one back here, is it? And then there's one here.
Marty, Rick Kaler, Rapid City Financial Advisor, sent an email to people to his contacts, and also printed in his article in Rapid City Journal the possibility of changing legislation so that Social Security numbers could be changed. Do you think that's any possibility or not?
The challenge is the federal government is the one that controls Social Security numbers. It's this whole Medicare card situation is going to be an issue too. I can just see it coming. We have enough Medicare, and Medicaid is a state-federal partnership. Medicare is a federal, very important benefit. And when it comes to Social Security numbers, much like any number, the problem with what Equifax did, they let out Social Security numbers, but they let out the driver's IDs too. And so one of the reasons we went to driver's ID, remember, is to better protect Social Security numbers. Well, it's just one more personal piece of information that gets out there that identifies and causes issues. I don't know the answer to that other than it would have to be the federal legislature to do it, not the state legislature. As we have done things to protect Social Security numbers, they have not worked. The different ID numbers, I oftentimes get worried that sometimes the more ID numbers we have, just like the more email addresses and the more other information, is the more ways that we get tripped up. Maybe sometimes we ought to just say, this Social Security number is a pretty big deal, And we ought to treat it that way, and we ought to protect it. And if we don't protect it, there ought to be a consequence. You may have to deal with the Attorney General, or you may have to deal with the Consumer Protection Bureau federal deal. I think sometimes we've taken it maybe a little bit too much for granted. And I am bringing that legislation, and I know Representative Van Etten was always supportive of his Attorney General when he was in the legislature, and I appreciate that. Frankly, the Attorney General has been blessed to have an awful good working relationship with the legislature. And this is, again, my opportunity to tell you that your legislators, you may not agree with their politics, their philosophies, et cetera, but when we brought that consumer package a couple years ago, Republicans and Democrats embraced it. It better protected you as a consumer, and we need to keep up on that with Equifax and these data breaches and other things. But I'm not sure that there's one perfect solution other than it goes back to education. Do everything you can to protect your personal identifying information, to know what your rights are, and if you have questions, take advantage of your Attorney General and let him know and his office know. Okay?
Question that is written down. I don't have a name, so I'm gonna go ahead and ask you about it. Are fingerprints vulnerable to hacking?
I'm going to tell you that everything's vulnerable. I mean, the bottom line is the IRS got hacked, and so everything is vulnerable, which is why protections need to be put in place. You know, any type of a database, whether it's fingerprints or other things, could be vulnerable, and that's why it's so important that we protect privacy, that we do everything we can to make sure it doesn't get out there for bad guys. But I mean, I have to answer that even though I don't like to, because I'm in charge of the state's fingerprint division at the Attorney General's office, and your sheriffs have their own different divisions that keep track of that. There are federal, and I'm not going to bore you to death, but there are federal databases with all that information in there. And so if it's your sheriff or it's your Attorney General or if it's the feds that get hacked, that information is vulnerable. And it's a reality, just like Target was and Neiman Marcus and just like Equifax was. And I can't stress enough, you know, South Dakota financial institutions are a large part of our state. I mean, we have some of the largest financial institutions nationwide right here in South Dakota. And they have a lot of private information and financial information in South Dakota. And that's why I need to be a little careful with the data breach bill that I bring. I have to make sure that it's workable with financial institutions as well as retailers and consumers. But yeah, all that information, especially with technology, is vulnerable.
So we have a question right there, and the last question is here. Please find my volunteers if you have questions.
I'll be very brief, and excuse me if I'm wrong or correct me, but to protect yourself is more important than being nice. So if I get a chance to talk to a human being on the phone that calls, and they try to coerce me into saying yes in any way, shape, or form that they can, I always question, who is this, and what is this about? And I never, ever say yes, because they can record that. And I don't know if they can use that against you. But
here's one idea for you. If you get that call and they're annoying you, say, you know what, I'm busy right now, but you can call me back. You can give me a call back at 1-800-300-1986.
very good.
And we'd be more than happy to set them straight.
Okay, the other half is we, I think, are in the process of being victimized on a cruise scam, and it has gone from $1,000 to $3,000. It has turned over 3 different crews, wherever they're from. And you were saying about the jurisdiction of South Dakota. Is there anything that can be done,
Marty,
or can we work on?
I think that'd be a good question for her to talk to Jody with after this. So, last question.
I am getting older and I have a brain injury. I would like to know what we can do for the mentally challenged about the robocalls, because you know they might not know what to do. Is there some kind of legislation that we can get going that would like take their names off of a phone list if you are disabled? Because we had a friend of ours who's schizophrenic, she had one of those policemen asking for funds. And I mean, just recently, I seen her on Monday and she told us about it.
I think the best answer for that is, and certainly always need to keep an open mind on potential legislation to better protect folks that need protecting, is we can put all the laws in place we want, but there has to be an enforcement mechanism. And what I mean by that is I look at this robocall issue, and there isn't a day goes by where our consumer division isn't getting frustrated in calls on it. The technology is now in place. And so what we need to do is focus on getting that technology in place so that we can enforce the laws that we have out there. And I'm frustrated that that's something that maybe hasn't necessarily been the priority of the federal government. It's too bad Washington isn't in touch with the people like we get to see here today, because I think if you were in Washington and you were hearing about this, you get the fact that this affects people. You're getting a robocall, some of them are saying several times a week. It's a distraction. And you don't want to get to the point where you're not even answering your phone anymore. And they're using technology to trick you. You talk about, I mean, it's called the spoofing, which is putting in a South Dakota number. So you see a 1605 Brookings, and you think, well, I can answer that. Or you think, oh, you know, it's somebody I know, and it's not. It's the bad guys. And so the hope is, and this is a good reminder for me to make sure I continue to be a loud voice to Washington and the Attorney General community, that they need to wake up and prioritize this. And hopefully they'll do that. And I know we're out of time for questions. I'm going to stick around here for a little bit. I was supposed to get on an airplane and go to another event. They just told me the weather's not going to permit that, at least right now. And so I can stick around here a little bit longer. If you've got some individual questions, I'd be more than happy to try to answer those. But I again want to just maybe close with, remember, this is about education and being proactive. I mean, you can kind of control a lot of this, especially you couldn't control what happened with Equifax, but you can control what happened now. If you've got questions, go get help, and getting help might be right at the Attorney General's office, so don't be afraid to let us know. I appreciate you being here today. I appreciate your interest in this area. God bless and have a great day.